Using reverb on drums can be tricky. If you're not careful, you can lose all the punch of the drums, making it sound washed out and artificial instead of big and deep. So in this video, I'm gonna break down some of the techniques we can use to make drums sound huge with reverb. I'll break things down and simplify exactly what we're looking for step by step when we use reverb on drums. So we first have to understand what is our goal with using reverb on natural acoustic drum sounds. And the goal with reverb on real drums is to make it sound like they were recorded in a bigger space. We don't want it to be super obvious that we're using reverb. We want it to feel like subconsciously you hear those drums in a bigger room with tall ceilings and a ton of depth. So listen to these drums. We've got X-Rack Pro processing all the individual mics, but then we also have Supernova on a few select tracks. Take a listen to what happens when we take Supernova off. So instantly when we bypass Supernova, we can hear the room kind of collapse on the drums. They sound super dry. They don't have that big room feel. And that feel is really important because it gives these drums a sense of depth. So let me break down exactly what each of these Supernova instances is doing on these drums to achieve that natural big room effect. So first we have this room track and we're completely crushing it with X-Rack Pro. Take a listen to it. So we're heavily saturating, we're multiband compressing, we're soft clipping, we're just completely crushing this room mic sound. And it sounds really cool. But since this was recorded with a single mic, it is in mono. So there is absolutely no stereo information in this track currently. And so what we want to do with Supernova is bring back some of that natural stereo image that you get when you have a sound in a room. Naturally, you're going to hear reflections bouncing off slightly differently on different surfaces and different angles, and it's going to create kind of a sense of stereo image, even if it's a mono source. So that's why we have Supernova loaded. We have the studio room selected. This is a fantastic sounding room algorithm. And just take a listen to this before and after. So you can hear how it pushes the sound back a little bit, but it also creates a little bit of a stereo image. It takes it from a completely mono sound to creating a little bit of interest in the left and right. Take one more listen to that and you're gonna hear how it just kind of spreads out like it's in a natural room environment. Now the setup is important here as well. You can see that we have a very short reverb time all the way down. We have 0% depth. We want this thing to sound up close to us, not too far away. And we also have a 0 millisecond pre-delay. This is because we don't want any kind of slap back effect. If we start adding too much pre-delay, we're going to start to hear those initial reflections coming back at us. Instead, for this particular track, we want that room algorithm to start working right away. Now, we're also blending in 50% of the dry signal as well. And we can almost use this as the amount of width we want. I think 50% sounds really natural and nice on this track. So that's the first thing we're doing to give these drums a bigger sense of space. Take a listen before and after X-Rack Pro and Supernova, and I'll do one after the other. So you can hear how it's just layering and making this sound even bigger. The next and most important part of the kit that creates the sense of space is usually the snare drum. Now this is almost always the case because we can usually let the snare ring out a bit more without muddying up the pattern of the drums. Of course, it depends on the specific arrangement and pattern that are being played, but in a track like this, we can let this snare ring out and it's not going to get in the way of anything else. So I've got Supernova loaded on this snare top mic, and just take a listen to what it's doing. So here we're using this room algorithm, another very natural sounding room. I've got it with a pretty long reverb time. This would be a really big room that it's in, but it sounds nice, especially in context of the mix. And we are using it with a low depth. So that means we're making that sound like it's much closer to the listener in the space. Take a listen as I play with this depth on this one. So at a high depth, it sounds like the snare is on the other side of the room. And at a low depth, it sounds like it's right in front of us, but we can still hear the sound traveling as far back in the room. So we can still hear the same sense of space. It's just where that snare is positioned within that space. You can tell again, we're using 0 milliseconds of pre-delay on this. You could experiment with more pre-delay if you want that kind of slap back sound. For this, on these algorithms, I want to let that take care of all the complex early reflection patterns. And I just want to use 0 milliseconds of pre-delay here. Now you can see that I'm also using the color. I'm using it to clean up some of the low end as well as darken some of the high end. So take a listen as we play with these. So you can tell how this really changes the character of the low end. It goes from super clear, like there's very little ringing out in the low frequencies, all the way to very extreme low end, which makes it sound very warm. It sounds like a very warm, rich reverb at this setting. But I like cleaning that up a bit. Let's hear the high end. So this one you can really hear on those sizzly highs. It's either ringing out a lot more in the high end, creating a little bit more of an artificial sound for this particular track, or we can create a more realistic sound with a little bit of damping on those high frequencies. So I'm liking this color here. The other thing we're doing is blending in the mix as well. Of course, around 50% seems to be pretty natural. But here's the probably most important thing we're doing with the snare reverb, which is ducking. And we're using ducking in order to preserve the crack of the snare. We're getting that stick hitting the snare head. We want to preserve that sound to retain the punch and keep that sound present. And we're using ducking to do it. Specifically, we're using ducking with this very tight ducking shape here. So take a listen to what this sounds like if we remove the ducking altogether. So if we remove the ducking, we're smearing the early reflections of that reverb in with the transient of the snare. But as we up the ducking amount, we're going to start to hear that separation of the transient from the snare and the decay of the snare along with the decay of the reverb tail. And that's going to create a little bit more natural of a sound on this drum. Now, obviously you can go too far like this, and this is where you start to hear the ducker kind of pick back up further after the transient. Take a listen. So you almost hear it kind of ghosting back in very far after the transient. We want to just tuck this in so that the reverb starts to come back in right after the transient. So, and we can still hear the stick hitting the snare head. It sounds really punchy there. Now I love using this trick on kicks, snares, toms, anything where you want to retain punch, but you still want to have a nice big tail on the reverb side. It works really well for this. So once I dial in the snare top, I copy that over to the snare sample, and usually I don't do anything on the snare bottom, although you certainly could experiment with it. I find that generally you get enough reverb just from the top, and if you have a sample, you'll get some reverb from that as well. But just listen to these. We've got Supernova on the top and the sample, and we've got nothing on the bottom. So this one really amplifies the size of the room, really makes it sound like it's in a much bigger space, but it still sounds natural. Now there's one more place we're using Supernova, and that is on the kick. And here we're doing it very lightly. Take a listen to what it's doing. Now here we're getting just a little tiny bit of space added, and that's really a stylistic choice. If this track needed a big pillowy kick, we'd probably do something completely different, maybe more similar to what the snare is doing. But for this particular track, we want to keep that kick really tight and punchy. It has to cut through the mix. And so we're going to leave it pretty much alone, but we do have a little bit of room reverb, this nice drum room, which has really complex early reflections. It sounds nice, especially on anything with a hard transient. And we're darkening the color, we're cleaning up a little bit of the lows and a little bit of mix here. So that sounds really nice. I like that. We're also using the ducking trick here as well. I think that sounds even more natural now. So that's a walkthrough of how we're achieving this natural drum room effect with Supernova. Now you can experiment with this, different algorithms. You've got all these different rooms and different algorithms to use. You can experiment with different depths or different amounts of reverb versus dry. You can experiment with using different colors or pre-delay or ducking settings. There's a lot to experiment with here, but this is the basic approach that I would use to get a very natural sounding drum room. Take one more listen before and after Supernova on these drums. So this is one of my favorite ways to make realistic drums sound even bigger. Of course, you can dial it into taste. You can use a little less snare verb and a little heavier on the kick or heavier on the rooms and less on the individual mics. But this general formula is a great way to get started with creating these realistic drum rooms. I hope you've enjoyed this video. Give it a like, leave us a comment, and subscribe for more tutorials like this. And as always, happy mixing.